So, welcome to another episode of Learning for Truth and Love. And so, today I'm going to continue the third of this part series talking about and exploring ideas about motivated thinking. And so, I want to, in some ways, sum up today why I chose to look at motivated thinking and its relevance to looking at curriculum development. And so, I am going to start by really talking about what Molden and Higgins refer to as outcome motivated thinking and how it's influenced how I approach a curriculum. And so, in some parts, I might even cite, and I'll let you know what I'm citing, some of what they've written. And in some cases, I'm going to use it to really trigger and to frame what I've done, some of what I've done with my curriculum work. Of course, for purposes of this talk, my goal is to make it a little less academic in some ways, and so that you can relate to and follow and understand how it will be relevant to you, no matter who you are or what your purpose is. And so, one of the things that Molden and Higgins talk about in terms of outcome motivated thinking is just how this has shaped our thinking. And I'm going to cite a few things that they say. I quote, individuals' preferences for certain outcomes are believed to often shape their thinking so as to all but guarantee that they find a way to believe, decide, and justify whatever they like. And in this section and in this page, he talks about the influence of attributes. And I want to explain to you why this is so significant. Because they cited a research which indicated that people often explain their success. They often attribute their success to internal things and internal causes, but their failures to external things. And one of the reasons this stands out to me is it's been the opposite, right? If you're a Black person, we often attribute, the success of Black people to the success to external things rather than internal things, and failures to internal things instead of external things, but it's completely opposite. So this is just one of the ways and one of the things that have really, driven my motivation to this work. I wanted to pursue what it is, and the evidence and the data would help us to understand how this applies to Black people, for example, that much of our successes are due to internal things, our perseverance, our own cultural capital, and a lot of the failures, as many people do, is attributed to external things, and also vice versa. I also wanted to show where our success could be attributed to internal and some of our failures to external. I wanted accuracy, and that was always my biggest motivator for accuracy. But I also influenced what type of evidence I looked for and where I would look for evidence from. And so I not only started looking at the historical documents, but also wanted to see what strengths, what inspirations, what successes I can draw from our own cultural capital historically. One of the things that I found some amazing things, and also the important part of this work has been using scientific evidence to show what is and what isn't. And these are things that I write about in my book and show how they apply. One of the things I was fascinated by was in documenting what has happened in crops of Africa. Scientists learned about at least 2,000 native crops to Africa. Oftentimes we associate the area, especially where Black people dwell, with being, impoverished and famished and not having any resources. And what happens is this creates a different storyline that many researchers have written about, related to the savior versus being the saved, as opposed to people who've been empowered for years for doing work and for, having our own culture. But I wanted to approach this scientifically because I wanted to have the evidence, and not only have the evidence, but create opportunities for other students to explore this evidence. And that's one of the things that my students were able to do. Part of the outcome of this research is creating data cards that students can use. And this was really important. The information source was important. To have students use these data cards to explore ideas about themselves and their culture, and I share some of those findings in my book, the amazing things that I learned about themselves that even they were surprised by. And so that's one of the things that has driven this research. One of the other citations that really stand out to me in this article is where Molden and Higgins talk about, I quote, the effects on evidence evaluation. And I'm going to cite this, I'm going to quote this from page 298. I quote, similar to these attribution effects, more recent research has found that motivations for positive self-evaluations also influence the way in which people evaluate information. It either supports or contradicts these positive self-evaluations. In general, individuals tend to give more credence to, and be more optimistic about the validity of information that supports or confirms their standing as kind, competent, healthy people, and two, be more skeptical and cautious about information that threatens that standing. I quote, unquote. So this is actually, it's interesting that I've kind of discovered a lot of this after I've written my book. But this has really been one of the ideas that has driven the way I've approached my work. Really understanding people and understandings about people, and what motivates people. Oftentimes, I find that people who we might classify as racist, from no matter which race they're from, often do think of themselves as kind, like to think of themselves as kind people, and perhaps are that in their particular neighborhoods or with people who are like them. I'm sure that there's some of that in there. But oftentimes, the need for this positive self-evaluations is what drives what type of evidence we look at. And so when it comes to the truth, the question is, if the evidence does not reinforce the positive self-evaluations that we have, oftentimes this might be ignored. And if the evidence does not support that we're kind, often it will be omitted. And so understanding what really motivates people and really what the struggle is, because many of you are surprised by outcomes without understanding why and what's happening. And many of us are experiencing and will be experiencing a lot of dissonance when it comes to discussing ideas, and when it comes to controversial issues, and when it comes to, wondering what and why, what's happening within our society, that we don't think it makes sense. Well, understand this. We do look for information. We do look for anything that supports our identity, even if it propels us forward, even if it propels us backwards. This is often what drives our decision making, the need for that. And what happens is, if the evidence points to negative attribution, it creates a dissonance. And many people don't know how to deal with that dissonance, especially if we thrive on perceptions, if we thrive on a need for perceptions, because, as society, we cast very harsh judgments on each other. That makes it very difficult, for people to be honest and to tell the truth. We have many dichotomies, or dichotomous way of thinking, whether it's good, bad, male, female, black, white, or dichotomous. It's very hard to break out of that dichotomous way of thinking. And most people don't know how to deal with that dissonance. And that's something, I have some great books that I've read that are really important for helping to deal with that dissonance that we'll talk about later on. So the biggest thing I want to highlight here is, as I pursue this work, I was also looking for a new way of thinking. And that really meant dealing with ways of thinking in tremendous ways that even I would not have anticipated. And so I was so excited and fortunate to have discovered people who have creatively and artistically honed in, and artistically and creatively have found ways to view themselves and their culture and ways to characterize things from a position of strength. And so I'm going to share one clip from my ventures to the Gullah Islands and one of the encounters I had with one of the artists in seeking to understand how our lived experiences bring out science. I don't think I included this clip in any of my videos because my focus was on bringing out the science in our culture, not necessarily on the thinking that has led to it. But I'm going to share it here now. So here is a 3-minute, 45-second piece.
Yeah, well, for me, without the faces, those pieces represent everyone. You know, it's, I try to capture the inner spirit of the person when you see the pieces without faces. Because it says if you, mix all the colors in the world together, you're going to get, and most of the ones without faces are the dark, black highlighted with blue. Because, like I said, if you combine all the colors in the world, that's the color that you're going to get. So it's representative of everyone. But like I said, more so the inner soul of the person. Because once I put a face on it, it can only be that one person. With the faces, and I have to tell you this, I paint by inspiration. So the person in the painting or the character in the painting literally tells me what they look like. It's like someone sitting on my shoulder and giving me a description and guiding my hands to create their faces. Like this particular piece right here, even though it's not based on the Gullah culture, it is African American history and culture. This piece I created for the 400-year commemoration in Hampton, Virginia, for the first African landing. And so this was my depiction of the first family, and of course you see their faces because I wanted to give them an identity. But then also the pieces with the faces, I don't know, here, or like our elders here, they'll say to you when they really want you to truly understand what they're saying, they'll say, look me directly in my eyes, because I want you to fully understand what I'm about to say to you. And it's very important. So I said it's their way of capturing our attention. And then for you to really listen to that story, because their story and their trials and tribulations is what guided them through the time that they went through. And so now you need those words of wisdom. So they want you to fully understand that.
So what does your painting tell us about Gullah Geechee culture?
Well, first, I always say this. The way that I create the pieces or tell the story and the clothing and the color is to understand, number one, that our ancestors were not slaves. They were agricultural engineers and masterful craftsmen and more who were enslaved because of their intelligence. And so when I create these pieces, that's what it's about. It's not about just painting a bright, bold, colorful piece. It's to really tell you who those people were and what they contributed, not only to the Gullah Geechee corridor, but to America. So like this piece, it's called American Gullah. And American Gullah, and it's kind of like a spin-off of American Gothic. These were truly the unsung pioneers of America. And they were brought here mostly from the west coast of Africa because of their ability to grow rice.
So for me, it was amazing to encounter someone who was able to, through her processes and her self-discovery, to see the beauty of our ancestry and to see the beauty of her own ancestry. And then I was able to identify with that because of our similar, and not our similar background, right? And our same source. Very similar to, hearing friends talk about their own European ancestry and looking back at old pictures. For me, because we didn't have those beautiful pictures to look at, it was really important to to be inspired and to change our way of thinking. And I realized as part of that research, that's something that I sought, internally motivated. My goal was to see the beauty. And through those travels, I was actually inspired by that. I didn't include of quite a few of these clips in, looking at the science of and to focus in on the specific science. And I think it's something, obvious. Unfortunately, it's we're in trying to be and in the goal of science to be objective, which is something I wrote about in one of my paper, that we can often leave out things, with the goal to be positivistic. But while I was focused on processes that was closest to science, it did make it a little bit more positivistic than post-positivistic, I think. But it does remind me of another quote that Molden and Higgins do talk about, that I'm going to quote in reference to desires for accuracy versus desires for closure. They talk about attribution. And I'm going to quote, in addition to citing to self-serving biases that occur when people explain their own performance. As described previously, research on attribution has also identified more general biases. For example, there is a tendency for people to fixate on one particular cause for some action or event and then fail to adequately consider alternative causes that are also possible, unquote. And so for me, because I was seeking accurate, and of course in other areas eager for closure in the end, but I was more eager for accuracy and motivated by wanting to see positive connections. I kept searching and kept looking for these connections and kept considering all alternatives, because a lot of it was not explicitly there. So I had to ask the questions. And this was the most important thing for me in finding the answers. The questions are extremely important. And one of the things I've learned from, teaching students about questions and people asking me questions, and me asking others questions, is seeing the type of questions that elicit certain type of answers, and how we do have to become more skilled at knowing what to ask for. And I think a lot of this is motivated by what exactly do we want to know. There was too much portrayal of this is the what, but less portrayal of this is the how, this is the why. And I figured by understanding the how and the why, that I could produce something that was the what, but also beautiful. That we could have science and we can have something beautiful to related to the strengths of our culture. And so let's see what else. So one of the things I ended up talking about quite a bit was the type of crops that were introduced here, generally to the Americas, whether it's here in North America, South America, from Africa. And something I end up talking about quite a bit are crops that have been native to the area. And I've showed people the pictures of images of, different types of melons, watermelon, cantaloupes, things that we love to eat. And again, it's not as simplified because there are variations from other countries, native to other countries. One of the things that came up quite a bit was, especially because of my journeys and because of the reading I did, I was lucky and able to find work that scientists had done comparing things like red rice, African rice, and white rice, right? And so we ended up having discussions about the nutrient content and the type of amino acids, the type of fat, which is one of the things that, distinguishes red rice from white rice. And the fact that you have more oils in red rice and it's more filling for that reason, but it also, more than likely because of oils, it will spoil more easily. But the fact that white rice grows quickly. So that's something we talked about in looking at the chemistry aspect, the nutritional aspect of the work. Students pursued questions based on the data that they had, because they learned about the different ways that our ancestors extracted milk from crops. And it was great to realize that many cultures were already doing this. Of course, now it's commercialized. And because it's commercialized, there's often the way of thinking that it was an original idea, because many people are allergic to dairy or things like that. But cultures have been producing milk from crops for ages. And so students were able to use the data to ask questions about the nutrients you would get and from one type of milk versus another. We also learned about different types of milks that were used predominantly by women during pregnancy, which I talk about in my book. One of the chapters in my book, I explore the type of questions and data that you could actually explore. But one impact of motivated thinking that came up in my work that I also talk about is how the goal, the motivated thinking, be the drive to make money, to be rich, led to how crops were discussed and classified. And we see this we see this in the work that was published by the National Research Council that I referenced, that oftentimes we characterize crops a certain way to minimize and to point to people away from it, letting them think that they don't need it. And the scientists talk about quote unquote minor crops. We would say it's minor. Or so we are poor man's food, right? And so I think that many cultures can relate to this, right? We talk about potatoes used to be considered poor man's food, right? Potatoes are associated with the Irish, right? And so we often do this pretty often with foods that will eventually not be associated with a certain culture that we've adopted. And maybe that's a process in our motivated thinking to have it be unassociated. But also when we see that cultures and people adopt it, then of course, and it becomes profitable, then we package it differently. I'll never forget years ago, I was part of my venture to explore, I thought of exploring real estate. And so I was going through a licensing process. And one of the things that the story the guy gave was he talked about how in some part of the Upper East Side that they took an apple and they packaged it in such a way. Part of it was marketing, right? And how you market things. And when you're talking about marketing, that they took an apple. I'm just going to say hypothetically, if this apple would have cost 10 cents, you put it in a shiny wrap and charge $5 for it because it allowed you to convince people that this apple is so worthy and so valued and so valuable to be packaged in this shiny wrap. And so it's very similar context, and it's very similar to what we do, right? We do have goals in the curricula, whether it's to achieve what some might call the melting pot. And that's something I do address as well. We do have goals. And so the question is, who do those goals serve? And so with the curricula, one of the things I focused on is allowing students to conduct inquiries that enable them to have emotionally rewarding experiences. And so I highlight some students' reactions to that, some of the things they've shared. And I guess one day I'll publish some of those lectures that I've given for those who might be interested in viewing them. I think one of the positives, well, I shouldn't say positive, but one of the things by going through the pandemic is that things became recorded. And so I have copies of some of the talks that I've asked people to post. The recording I showed you was of artist Sonja Griffin Evans, and she is a cultural heritage artist who has done some amazing, amazing work. And I realized that a lot of her recordings didn't make it to the final cut because she really was able to talk about her internal journey, and which I think is still important to talk about. It's still important to show, and it's still important to understand just the comfort, the positive things, the identity search that comes out in our search for our truth and our search for our heritage and our search to make these connections. But I think the most important thing I'm going to end up doing one day, and probably on this podcast, is really showing you how that already comes out in the curricula, the science curricula too, for white people, for people of European origins, and ways that we don't talk about, and ways that probably some don't even understand that that is their internal journey. But since I've had opportunity to give feedback and to even observe that during the curriculum development process, I'm going to, really, I'm going to provide some insights on that one day. But I say all of this to say that since, part of my interviews of the Kalikichi folks, did bring out the positive things about the culture as well as our dark history. And a lot of the dark history I did end up cutting out of the videos to focus on the science of it. That was part of the thing that I wanted to focus on, especially for little kids who learn about our culture. I wanted them to introduce that to them our contributions, and remember that that's one of the discussions we've had in society, where there are some in society who think and believe that people of African descent and African Americans have contributed nothing to this society. And so it was important for me to really make sure that, we need to make sure that people understand what these contributions are, and so that they don't falsely believe that that is true. But having grown up with a curricula influenced by motivated thinking, to only highlight European culture and the positive things of European culture and the negative things of European culture, and I say the word motivated by, mainly because of what the outcome has been. It could be that some people wanted to that their way of being positive was the actual inclusion of, and that was one step. It's very difficult for us to be and produce outcomes that is not internal to us. Who is going to explore in depth and deeply and with a certain lens the type of beauty that we want to identify with in our particular culture, whatever culture that may be? And so this is important to show. One of the things that came up that I ended up writing an entire chapter on was talking about object and place, and the emphasis in the curricula of objects that we choose and how we associate with them. Very tricky, very interesting. There's a whole field of study devoted to, museums and how, a lot of people of African descent, we look at the museum and feel that it's obviously, for most part, they weren't created for us. The objects, tell a different story, and the story they tell can emphasize belonging for one and reinforce a lack of belonging for others. But also, as we see, ideas of belonging could be very tricky, because we can feel like we belong no matter where we are, and we can feel like we don't belong no matter where we are. There's an internal journey related to this. And this is why I really wanted to focus on motivated thinking, because there's an internal journey and there's an external journey to understanding not only what goes into the curricula, but understanding our own why. And also knowing that these journeys take a while, and sometimes we're willing to work on it, and sometimes we're not willing to work on that. But wherever we are, it will motivate the outcome. Guarantee. But I also say this to say that this journey is for everyone, no matter what culture you're from. Because part of this work was really interesting to see. Part of what this work reveals is who actually took the internal journey and who did not. Because asking questions of different people, seeing who was able to provide insights and who were not, sometimes we might be surprised who is and who isn't. But it's all based on our own experiences and based on, our own thinking. Sometimes the need for closure means that, looking at the evidence will be very difficult. And that's one of the things I experienced during this curricula. I had to take breaks from it, because looking at the truth and looking at what happened and trying to figure out how to, in some ways, reframe it without taking out the truth, and the level of distress I experienced delving into the archives meant that this was as much an emotional journey as much as it was a scholarly journey in looking at evidence. So I want to leave you here with a clip. And in this clip, really want to highlight, and I've noticed I focused on one in my other videos. The science videos, I focus on other people I interviewed, but recognize the internal journey that leads one to view things differently and a need to view things differently and what it might take for you to view things differently. One day I'll talk a little bit about what it has taken for me to view things differently, but I'm going to leave you with a clip by artist Sonja Griffin Evans.
The lady in the painting, if you notice, you'll see rice coats written across her bosom because she is the keeper of her culture and her heritage. And she wants to pass that down to her young. So hence you see those words written across her bosom. And of course, you'll see the sweetgrass basket, which is a fanner basket, which is what they use, to separate the chaff from the rice. But it's also near her womb, where it is a portal from the spiritual realm into the physical realm. Because the other thing about Gullah Geechee people, we are very spiritually based, And so if you notice in this painting, you don't see any worldly possessions. All you see is separation in the cloud and the three birds in the sky, signifying the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And so these people were literally building their riches up in heaven. So that's the other thing I try to convey through my work is the faith that these people had. Yeah.
I noticed you also made you made a point to include the tools.
Yes. And so because when you think about it, these people, our ancestors, literally cleared thousands and thousands of acres of land with mere tools like that, And in American, I have to tell you this, in American Gothic, the gentleman is holding his farming tool in his right hand. So when I painted this, I was inspired to put the tool in his left hand. So after I completed the painting, because a lot of the paintings have different symbolisms in them. So I looked up left-handed people, and it said that left-handed people normally make up a higher percentage of all geniuses. And they're normally mathematical geniuses, which they had to have those skills in order to, calculate, the distance, the flow regulation of water. And they had to be very creative. And so that's another thing. So they, left-handed people are very creative. So in each of these pieces, like I said, there's a symbolism, but then there's a meaning behind the meaning of each of the pieces.
Wow.
Yeah.
And this piece is also reminding me of just the Gullah Geechee culture being stewards.
Oh, of course.
Of the land.
Of course. They were stewards of the land and still are.
Right.
And then it says, and it also reminds me, generations passed down, is that we are, keepers of our culture. And it's up to our ancestors passed down a great inheritance to us, and we are to be a good steward of what we have been given. So that's what, I'm glad you said that, because that's what that piece also represents to me, because it said this is, you have to carry the torch to the next generation, passing down our history and our culture.
So if you like this podcast, please subscribe to get the notification for the next one and follow. And thank you.